Hello everyone, welcome back to yet another video. Today we are going to take a look at Elysium and Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality. So this is the first part of two parts of our look at the ethics of the global distribution of wealth. Sorry for the awkward pause. All right, so first, let's talk about the film. What's going on in the film? How does this topic come up? And then after that, we'll take a look at Singer's piece and what's going on in there. So we've got this film, Elysium. Well, I've taken over Matt Damon's face. I don't know, what do we think? Am I a more handsome Matt Damon? All right. So what does that even mean? Am I more handsome Matt Damon? Does that mean I'm actually Matt Damon, but I'm a more handsome version of? I don't know. Let's forget about it. Let's just forget about it. Okay. So the film, it's set in 2154. So here we have another futuristic film. So Ready Player One is a little bit futuristic. This one's even more futuristic. Ready Player One is at least still this century. This one is sort of anticipating. You know, let's look ahead 134 years. A good way to think about this film, and we're going to see this come up again in Chappie, another Neil Blomkamp film. So he's the director. He also did District 9. Something Blomkamp does in the film is really take some trends that are occurring and just sort of pushing them into the future and just saying, okay, what if we don't really change anything? What might happen? So there are a couple of two or three trends, I think, that we can look at that he's sort of picking up on. One, the advances in technology, including what's going on in space. So we, of course, have Elysium as the space habitat where people permanently live, and there's travel between Earth and up there. So one is the technological progress, and then there's the robots as well, these sort of autonomous robots that go around and act in certain ways. And Chappie's really going to pick up on that and do something interesting with that in terms of, well, can machines think? At what point would we actually want to regard them as persons to some degree? But that's getting ahead of ourselves. So one thread in the film is the technological progress. So it is a sci-fi film. Another trend in the film is, the one we're most interested in, is really the gap between rich and poor, and how that gap is increasing in certain sorts of ways. Now, of course, that gap is also decreasing in other sorts of ways. So, and Singer's piece talks about, extreme poverty. Extreme poverty has fallen since Singer wrote the piece back in 1972. So in overall terms, I believe, and we'd have to look at the historical data. I think I've got some of that in my notes here. There are fewer people living in extreme poverty, not being able to basically afford the necessities of life. Today, in 2020, than say back in 1972. But at the same time, we also have more and more very, very wealthy people. So like super wealthy, super elite. And so something that the film helps bring into stark contrast for us is really that gap between rich and poor. And it helps do that by really sticking the rich out on Elysium, putting it in the sci-fi setting, making it unfamiliar in certain sorts of ways. So we've got the technological progress, that's one trend. The wealth divide or wealth gap, increasing numbers of super wealthy, super elite, and as well as increasing numbers, right, population growth, increasing numbers of people who are impoverished, certainly to some degree. That's what we see with Max and Frey and Spider, so all the denizens of Earth. So we have the super elite living up on Elysium, and then at least the appearance we get in the film is that the vast majority of Earth citizens are impoverished. They lack health care. right? And they really seem to lack opportunity. They don't have the same sorts of opportunities and resources as people on Elysium. Uh, they're not allowed to go to Elysium, right? There's this very strict policing of the sort of space border. Um, People on Earth, it seems like, and here again, there's some questions about exactly, to what degree do people actually have work or not. When we see Max in the Armadine factory and everything, and he shows up late with the fractured arm and everything, the manager, his boss, you're lucky to have this job. I'm talking to you a day's wages. You're lucky to be here. And then of course he gets, irradiated, terminally irradiated at work. Why? Well, because he knows it would be dangerous to go in there, but the same boss comes by and says, look, if you don't get in there and put yourself in, right, if you don't risk your life right now, you're going to be fired, and then you're out of here. So it at least suggests to us that there are relatively few jobs, right? Or at least that employment is scarce. It's not like everybody has a job, everybody's doing well. And in fact, one interesting thing we see is that the job Max has is working in the Armadine factory, producing these robots, which then in turn are used to police the citizens of Earth. Right. So even the job of being a police officer or a parole officer, those have been automated. Those have been turned into robot jobs. So we've got all sorts of people without work, it seems like. Another theme that I think we were pretty safe in reading in as well is just population dynamics and climate change as well. So Earth looks hot. It does not look appealing. It looks dirty. It's grungy. It looks hot. We don't see green spaces and nice things except up on Elysium. The area they're in, right, the city and everything, utterly sprawling, huge, falling apart to some extent, dirty. The healthcare system is, utterly overwhelmed, right? There's people everywhere, in the waiting room and everything when he goes and actually sees Frey again and all this sort of thing. Earth is in bad shape. The majority of the population on Earth does not seem to be doing well. Now, even what we see there is not extreme poverty, probably, at least for the most part, in the sense that those people at least seem to be able to, have the necessities of life, food and water and this sort of thing. But they certainly don't seem to be doing well, all things considered. So that's really some of the themes coming together in the film. Now, Max himself, and this is really the story we see, finds himself in a very unenviable situation. So he gets terminally irradiated, right? He gets hit by radiation. He's got 5 days to live, get some pills, and all right, well, get out of here. This will keep you going until you're dead. Bye. And then that seems to be it, right? So it's this very lopsided power dynamic between Armadine and this very powerful, the super wealthy that control the corporate interests and policing and all this sort of thing. And then people like Max who are really, caught in the sort of gears of the whole thing. Now, he goes to, I'll loosely say his friend Spider, but he doesn't seem like the greatest friend, but maybe acquaintance. Right? Goes to Spider, wants a ticket, he wants to get up to Elysium because that's where there is healthcare, right? And in fact, this is the interesting thing. So the healthcare system on Earth seems utterly overrun, but up on Elysium, well, you can step into a med bay and cure basically anything. And in fact, something we don't get quite explicitly in the film, but does seem plausible to read in, is that the people of Elysium are genetically enhanced, at least in some sort of way. That medbay technology they have is able to, find disease, cure disease. It seems like they have really mastered the ability to manipulate and control the human body in such a way as to make it really do what we want it to do. And this is part of why I have Elysium in the genetic engineering topic that we're going to look at next week, as well as Gattaca. Gattaca, it's a bit of an older film. It's certainly slower. It's not an action film like Elysium is. Much more of a drama. It's in many ways, like Unthinkable is just sort of written for the topic. Gattaca is very much written for genetic enhancement, though Gattaca is also older, so it's interesting to see differences in time and sort of imagination about what the future might be like. So we'll get around to that. So if Max thinks, if he can get up to Elysium and get a citizenship so he can use a med bay, he can save his own life. And that's really his motivation in the film, right? And we see, early in the film, Max is very much keep his head down, right? He's going to work, he's on parole, he's in some sense trying to reform himself and lead an honest life in this not very good world he finds himself in. Then, through no fault of his own, he gets irradiated. His life is basically on a timer. He's got what he considers to be his only shot at survival, which is doing the job for Spider, getting up to Elysium, using a med bay, and then whatever happens from there, he doesn't seem too interested in. That's his goal: survival, self-interest. Right? Max is out for Max. Now, through the film, he reconnects with Frey, his childhood sweetheart, maybe we'll say. Of course, Frey now has a daughter, Matilda, who has leukemia and approaching death herself. Again, Earth's healthcare resources really can't help her. And in fact, where we see the scene where Frey is told that she has to take Matilda home. She can't keep her at the hospital where she works. And she kind of, well, look, she could have a seizure at any time. Well, yeah, she might, but we don't have the resources to keep her here, even though she's dying and you work here. So you got to take her home and, well, hope for the best, even though we know she's terminally ill. So even though, and so, Max, there's this fight scene and all this, there's some action. And then he goes to Frey for help. And then Frey does help him, right? Brings him in, stays up, performs basically at-home surgery with him and everything. And then the next day, once he's awake and everything, well, right, he takes off. I'm so, I can't help you, right? I need to get out of here. And, there is a good point there. He raises that, the people who are after him would probably kill Frey and Matilda if they found Max with them. But of course, it's, Frey goes out of her way, puts herself at risk to help Max. And then when she asks for Max's help to, save Matilda, right, the answer is basically, no, can't help you. Right? Too bad, I'm out for myself. I need to go try to save my life. Now, to be fair, was it really realistic? Could Max really help Matilda at that point? Not really clear. But as the film progresses, again, spoiler alert, it turns out that Max has this program that can reboot Elysium, at which point a new president could be installed, which is why it was made in the first place. Delacourt, Jodie Foster, right? That's wanted that. That's why it exists. But Max has it, and then Spider realizes what it is, and that you could not only alter the code for who the president is, but you could also alter the code for who counts as a citizen. So everybody on Earth could be made a citizen. But, right, the catch is the security protocol on it is set to lethal. So to actually use the code, Max has to die. Of course, Max, being motivated by self-interest, when finds out this is what it is. Well, okay, even before that, right, has this code in his head. He decides he's going to go cut a deal with, Elysium, right? Look, I'll give them what they want. This is worth a lot to them. All I want's a med bay. I want to live, right? He's in it for him, even though Spider says, look, this is really valuable. Like, this is, we could do things with this, right? Max, no, doesn't care, right? And then it's only really at the end of the film when Spider's up there, and it comes to Max's attention that it's set to lethal, so it's going to kill him. But of course, he realizes at that point that he really can't cut a deal, or at least it doesn't seem like he can cut a deal, right? He was caught, he was strapped down. Delacourt said, look, I don't care if it kills him, just get that out of there. It's at that point Max finally makes the decision to do the right thing, if that's what we think it is. Make all the citizens of Earth citizens, or make all the people of Earth citizens of Elysium, so they have access to the resources like healthcare and so on. But of course, he only does that after a couple of things happen. One, probably he realizes he can't cut a deal on his own. 2, he knows that to use the code to do that, he has to die. And 3, Frey and Matilda are up there, and he's sparked this connection. There's still that love of Frey there. Perhaps he comes to love Matilda, right? Again, questions about exactly what can we read in. This is where stipulating assumptions are really good, right? But he has this special relationship. He knows he can only help save Matilda, who is now in a coma, like she's very, very close to death, if he himself dies. So in a lot of ways, his hand seems forced, right, at the end of the film. He sort of does the right thing, but does he do it for the right reasons? So this is really the setup. So Max tries to save himself over saving other people to start with. In the end, he does sacrifice himself for Matilda, it seems like, and saves everybody else as a side effect. Or maybe his aim was to help everybody, and then saving Matilda was the side effect. Who knows? This is where the making some assumptions is pretty useful. Why did he make the choice he did? Right? Does he think he has no choice just to save himself? Right? Probably, given the situation. Does he do it to save Frey and Matilda? Right? Maybe. In which case, what are his motivations there? Is he sacrificing himself to save somebody he loves? Is he sacrificing himself to help everybody else? Right? What impact, what influence does his motivations have on the moral status of his actions, if any? Right? Maybe some, maybe none. Now, Elysium's conclusion is very simple. The end of the film, or at least what it seems like. Right? After all the people of Earth are made citizens of Elysium, shuttles are dispatched to deliver medical aid. But of course, just assuming the population growth continues, there are going to be several billion people on Earth, probably upwards of 10 billion by that point. Elysium is a large structure, but compared to Earth is quite small. Right? How many people live on Elysium? Maybe a few million, would be my guess. Right? Quite possibly less, with the size of the houses and estates and all this sort of thing. It could be in the thousands, right? Like probably tens of thousands, but it could be less. Here again, we can make certain inferences based on what we see, but the population of Elysium is much, much smaller than the population of Earth, which means even with their extreme wealth and lots of healthcare services there, the resources they have, those resources would not scale well to the population of Earth, right? Even with med bays and things like that. Now, of course, at the end of the film, happy tragic ending, right? Oh, he sacrificed himself to save everybody and help everybody on Earth. Really? Like how? You see the shuttles come down, people run towards it. Yay! How many people do they actually help? How long would it take to cure all the people of Earth of all their various ailments using the resources from Elysium? What are the implications for Elysium itself, right? Stripping away those resources. Of course, you might say, and I might say, well, who cares, right? Screw them. They're a bunch of greedy, selfish jerks anyways. Okay, maybe. But that conclusion seems very simple, right? We just sort of flip the switch, we make everybody a citizen, and then everybody's got the resources they need. Probably not, right? We could probably take all the resources out of Elysium, spread it among the population of Earth, and of course the people of Earth would be better off. They would have more than they did, but how much better off would they be, right? How far would those resources stretch? It's a good question, and one we really don't have enough material to answer with certainty. But I think the end of the film sort of puts a happy face on it, right? Oh, look, if we just did this, that'd be great, right? So look, there's two interesting questions that arise out of Elysium, I think. So, well, okay, potentially more, but for our purposes too. First, what moral obligation, if any, do the wealthy have to assist the needy, right? Elysium makes the contrast between rich and poor quite stark to us by making it unfamiliar, right? We are already in a situation in which millions of people suffer and die from preventable causes. I did a quick check before I came on here, just sort of looked at the UN on extreme poverty. The data was from several years ago. I think it was 2015 or something like that. but it's still something like 700 and some million people at that point live in extreme poverty on Earth, which is defined as living on something like $1.90 a day. And we have, right, billionaires, right? We'll use the phrase super billionaires, right? People with billions upon billions of dollars. And then, right, so there is a super wealthy elite here on Earth, and their ranks have grown over the past decades, right? That is something newish, though, of course, if we look through our history, there are, you look back in the Middle Ages, you have most people, the majority, right, being peasant farmers, and then you have kings and nobles and things like that, right? So in some sense, there has always been some kind of stratification of human society, at least to some degree, and I'll add a caveat as well, in most social structures, most human social structures. So it's not the case that all of them have had this kind of differentiation. But it's not like it's completely new that, oh, we have, people with lots of resources, people with fewer resources. But this is something we have, that gap between, the number of people who are incredibly wealthy and how much wealth they control is something that has been growing. Then again, there are fewer people living in extreme poverty these days than there were, say, back when Singer's article came out. So there are questions here about the distribution of wealth and what should we be concerned about, right? So this first question, what moral obligation, if any, do the wealthy have to assist the needy? That's the first one. Second question, what are the foundations of morality? Is self-interest antithetical to morality or a key part of it? To what degree should our self-interest guide our morality and our decisions? And to what degree does proximity matter? We are far away from many of the world's most needy. Similarly, the citizens of Elysium are far away from the world's most needy. If distance has an effect on our moral obligations, then presumably one can free oneself from a duty to aid others simply by moving oneself farther away from them, say onto a space station if we had one of those. So it's these questions that are going to frame our content here, our look at Elysium. So the first piece we're going to look at is by Peter Singer, who is a contemporary utilitarian. So we're looking at Bentham. Bentham was sort of the founder of utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill, a big proponent, popularizer of it. Peter Singer is the contemporary utilitarian. He identifies as such. He has a number of controversial stances on what we're going to look at here, the duty to aid the needy, questions of animal rights. He's largely pro animals can feel pleasure and pain, therefore they are moral agents like we are, therefore they deserve rights similar, not exactly equivalent, but similar to rights that humans have, et cetera, et cetera. Euthanasia, persons with disabilities. Interesting, controversial figure, worth sort of looking up and reading a little bit on if you're interested in what he's got to say here and you think he might have something else worth looking at or thinking about. And I'm going to be talking a little bit as we get through this piece on a more recent publication of his, which is called The Life You Can Save, which is a little tiny book that came out in 2009. So I'll have a couple of stats from there as well, which gives, that book really gives a kind of an update on the argument he's making in Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Okay, so this piece from 1972, I've broken it down into three parts. So first we get an argument that those able to assist those suffering from poverty have a duty to do so. So it's really going to get the argument in a slide. It's quite straightforward. He does well to just sort of lay it out for us for the most part. Second, he clarifies the argument in the conclusion. So he gives some clarifications about what exactly he means. And then third, deals with two objections. So raises and responds to two objections to the argument. And then considers three practical points that are worth thinking about in relation to the conclusion and the argument he has. All right, so let's just get to it. So what is the argument, right? First, the assumption, somebody's stipulating their assumptions, right? The assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. And as Singer himself puts it, I'm not sure how many people are going to disagree with that assumption. If they do, I probably don't have enough in common with them to try to rationally argue about it. Right? So he says, no, if people suffer and die because they don't have food and medical care and adequate shelter, that's not a morally bad thing. That's fine. Everything's great. What do you do at that point, right? What would they consider to be bad, right? Or in some sense, morally problematic. So he really just doesn't have anything to say with somebody who would disagree with one, right, with the assumption. 2, if it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything else morally significant, we ought morally to do it. Now, Singer here gives an example that John Stuart Mill himself used. Bentham may have used it. I can't remember off the top of my head. The drowning child example. So this is right from the article. This is from Singer's piece. If I'm walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is morally insignificant. Well, the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. Now, I added in the word morally there. So really, he says, this will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant. Well, the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. Right? Now, there is actually a hidden premise in the argument that needs to be added for this to make sense. He doesn't quite say it because it seems almost too obvious to him. It is in the power of the affluent to reduce suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care, but providing funds to the impoverished. There are wealthy people. They have money that they don't need for survival, right? Food, shelter, medical care, those are necessary to survive, right? And we're talking about things like extreme poverty. That's how we're trying to measure. It's not like, oh, could they afford a new car, right? No, could they afford enough food to not be malnourished? Can they afford sufficient shelter, right, to seek protection from the elements and so on? Can they get medical care when they're sick, right? That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about like, oh, did you get a new Rolex or, whatever. We're talking about sort of the things that if you don't have funds to get, if you can't get these, you are going to suffer and at some point die. So conclusion, right? Therefore, the affluent ought to provide funds to the impoverished to reduce suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care. This is really the argument, right? It's pretty straightforward argument, right? There might be other assumptions or details that should be added, right? Maybe not. And we're going to see Jan Narveson next day, tomorrow, argue against Singer's conclusion, right? And he's going to do that in part by examining the foundations of morality and thinking about what sorts of moral duties we really have. Okay, so here's the argument. Now we're going to get to the clarifications. First, take a look at premise 2, right? If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything else morally significant, we ought morally to do it. Singer says there's 2 versions of that premise, right? There's a strong version and a weak version. The weak version reads this way, right? The strong version reads this way. So the difference lies in whether or not we're sacrificing anything else morally significant, period. The second version relies on sacrificing anything else of comparable moral significance, right? Now, Singer endorses the strong version, that if it's in your power to prevent something very bad from happening, and you don't have to sacrifice anything else of comparable moral significance, then you ought to do it. So you might have to sacrifice something of moral significance, but if it's not of as much moral significance as the bad thing you're preventing, then you still should do it. So look, just for instance, on that strong version, right? Let's say you have promised somebody you care about very deeply, right? A child, a parent, a sibling, I don't know, your gerbil, whatever, that you're going to do something for them. You're going to go to their recital, you're going to be there for their birthday, you're going to, I don't know. I don't know what to say about the gerbil. Maybe forget the gerbil. I'd stick with real humans that we care about deeply. Right, I'll be there to donate a kidney for you or whatever. To break that promise would be of moral significance, significance, right? That would be problematic. You'd have to sacrifice keeping your promise, say, to wade in and save the drowning child. But on the strong version of the principle, right, on the strong version of the premise, Singer says, look, saving the life of the drowning child is very significant morally speaking, right? That's huge. Now, say you have to break a promise to do it, right? Now, breaking a promise is morally significant, but it's not as morally significant as saving a life. So, right, he endorses the strong version. So he'd say, look, if you have to break a promise to save a life or, right, something like that, give up something of moral significance, but it's not of as much moral significance as the thing you're preventing, right, the bad thing you're preventing, then you should still do it, right? You have a moral obligation to do it. On the weak version, it's the weaker version of the premise. It's instead of sort of evaluating and trading off moral significance and going for whatever's stronger, instead it's just a question of whether or not you have to sacrifice anything of moral significance. So let's stick with the example, right? You've made a promise to whatever, right? Whatever it is, just, you know, it's important, right? It's to somebody who's important to you. It's about an important matter. You've made some sort of promise to them. To save the drowning child, you'd have to break that promise, right? You're already just about running late for the recital or the organ donation or whatever. You see the drowning child. There's nobody else around. You don't have a cell phone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Either you go and save them or, right, presumably they're going to drown. Right? Now, if you go save them, you're going to have to break your promise. On the weak version, because you'd have to sacrifice something of moral significance, namely breaking the promise, on the weak version, you aren't morally obligated to go save the child. Right? But if you could go save the child and not have to sacrifice anything of moral significance, right? Say you really wanted to catch a movie, right? And if you go save the child, where you're going to miss it, right? You're going to miss the opening credits, and you just love those. Well, that's not of moral significance, right? You might love the opening credits, but whether or not you catch them right now or see them another time or, you know, just never get to see that movie at all, probably isn't morally significant, right? You'd like to, but, you know, getting sort of mere preference satisfaction like that, getting that kind of mere pleasure isn't always morally significant. Right? Of course, that might sound sort of funny for a utilitarian, but it's this question about, okay, if we're weighing these things against each other, which comes out on top, saving a life. Okay, so there are these two versions of premise 2. Singer endorses the strong one. He thinks the strong one's the right one, but the argument works with the weaker one, so he's willing to settle for the weaker one for the sake of the argument. Now, there's two clarifications on premise 2 that he wants to offer. First, distance is irrelevant to what our moral duties are, though it may influence whether or not we actually do what we should do. So distance may affect whether or not we actually help someone, right? But distance is irrelevant to what our moral duties are as long as we accept a basic commitment to impartiality, right? To whom we have moral obligations is really an impartial matter. It's not just that you have moral obligations to your family or friends or people you particularly care about. You have moral obligations to all persons. So thinking about this, right, when we think about ourselves, and let's come back to the conclusion, right, that the affluent have a duty to help the needy. Well, who's the affluent? Really anybody who has enough funds to potentially save somebody's life. That probably could include me, right? I've got enough stuff. I got a bunch of books on the shelf there. I could probably sell those, get rid of them, right? Try to get it together enough money to save a life. Right now, there's nobody saying in my neighborhood that I'm aware of, you know, dying because they don't have food or medicine or shelter, right? But I'm aware, just sort of generally, that there are people in the world that don't have those things. So don't I have a duty to help them, right? As long as I'm not giving up anything of moral significance. This is really the question. So Singer admits that it's possible that we're in a better position to judge how best to help those closest to us, right, the people that we're familiar with. But that doesn't affect our obligation to actually help the distant needy, because one, the distant needy are usually in more dire need than the nearby needy. Just think about where most people who are in extreme poverty actually live, right? And many of them continue to be in sub-Saharan Africa, other places as well, but I'm just thinking back to the UN site I was looking at a little bit earlier. Second, communication technologies have advanced to a point that makes distance hardly relevant. And three, famine relief organizations can and do keep staff in disaster-prone areas, and they can best judge how to direct aid, right? So even if we might be less inclined, perhaps psychologically, to help the distant needy, right, people far away from us who are suffering due to a lack of resources, Singer claims that it doesn't matter how far away they are, we still have a duty to help them. Now, just thinking about Elysium here, right? Think about it. Let's say we want to object to this, and we say, look, distance really is a relevant factor related to our moral duties. We're going to see Narveson, the author for Next Day, make this claim. If distance really is a factor in our moral duties, then the citizens of Elysium, right, those super wealthy, those super elite, by getting farther away from needy people on Earth, they actually reduce their duty or their obligation to help those people. Right? So if you were right there, right, and think about maybe the drowning child case again. If you're walking by and you see the drowning child, well, Singer argues you have a duty to go save them, right? It's your moral duty. You do something wrong if you don't help them. But just by being farther away, you wouldn't have the duty, right? So couldn't it be the case that just, if you see the drowning child, just by running in the other direction very, very quickly, you somehow get rid of your duty to assist them? That would seem odd. Another weird example, right, or counterexample. If somebody wants to say that, in fact, distance is relevant to our moral duties, does that mean murdering somebody with a sniper rifle is less morally problematic than murdering them with a knife? Because with the sniper rifle, you were farther away. Therefore, your duty towards them was somehow less, right? Maybe not. I think there are good reasons to actually reject that particular view, but we'll get around to that next time. All right. The second clarification. The fact that others could help another, somebody, a needy person, somebody in need, right, that they could help prevent something bad from happening. The fact that others could help has no effect on our moral duty to assist, right? If we are the only ones who can prevent something bad from happening, we ought to do it. We tend to feel less guilty if other people could also prevent something bad from happening, but don't. But that doesn't actually change our moral duty. For instance, if we go back to the drowning child, and there are several people, all equidistant from the child, right? They're all, say there's this sort of little circular pond, the child's in the middle of it. There are several people all sort of at the edge of the pond watching the child drown. Just because there are several people there who could go and save the child, but aren't doing it, doesn't mean that any particular person's duty to go save the child is somehow waived or lessened. Right? You still do something wrong by not wading in and saving the child, even though there are other people there who could have done it. Right? They could have done it, but they're not doing it, which means you still have a duty to do it. Now, of course, you might feel less guilty about not saving the child if there are a bunch of other people there who also didn't save the child. But Singer says that's irrelevant to whether or not you had a moral duty to help them in the first place. Right? That's a psychological fact about when we feel guilty and how much guilt we feel and so on. But that's irrelevant to whether or not we had a moral duty to go in and actually assist. Thinking about helping the distant needy, right? If everyone were helping the distant needy, the degree of our obligation would diminish. Say we all gave $5 or whatever the amount was. And by doing that, we could eliminate suffering and death from preventable causes. Right? If everybody on Earth who had sufficient funds gave $5 to, relieving the, basic necessity needs of needy people, right? So they had adequate food, shelter, and medical care. You know, say it was just $5. If we all gave $5, problem would be solved. Nobody would be in extreme poverty anymore, right? If that was the case and everybody was actually giving $5, then we'd only be obligated to give $5. But few people give any money. So giving $5 is not going to eliminate suffering and death from preventable causes. So because many other people aren't doing what they should, that does mean that our own obligation then increases, right? Each individual has a duty to do as much as they can without anything, sacrificing anything of moral significance on the weaker version of premise 2, or anything of comparable moral significance if we go with the stronger version of it. Now, it might be objected that if we all do as much as we can, we'll overshoot the mark, and we'll actually give more than we should or do more than we should. Two responses. First, that outcome is unlikely, given how many people currently do little or nothing, right? Second, it's better for us to overshoot the mark, to give too much, to expend too many resources trying to solve these problems, than to undershoot the mark and to not do enough. If we overshoot the mark, we wind up with too much money being, or too many resources being sort of spread around and offered and then not being used. So they might go to waste. But on the flip side, right, you know, if we don't get it just exactly right, which is unlikely, right? We're probably never going to get it just exactly right. So what's worse? To have wasted resources, to have too many resources sort of sitting around not being used, right? To have unused hospital beds, say, or to undershoot the mark, don't give enough, and have at least one person die from preventable causes. That's the response. Okay, so moving on. The outcome of this argument, Singer tells us, is that our traditional moral categories are upset. Aid to the impoverished is usually seen as supererogatory. That's a technical term in moral philosophy, which really means that it's good to do, but not obligatory. So, you know, for instance, it's good to give to charity. You know, this is the way we usually think. It's good to give to charity, right? You do a good thing by doing it, morally good thing. But you don't do anything wrong by not giving to charity. Right? That's how we normally think. Similarly, if you save the drowning child, right, often we might look at that, and this, I think this one, intuitions differ a little bit more. But by saving the drowning child, if we look at that as supererogatory, then you do something good, perhaps even somewhat heroic by saving the drowning child. Though, of course, you wouldn't have done anything wrong by not doing it, right? Now, of course, in the drowning child instance, depending on the situation, you know, that's, I think our intuitions might pull in different directions there, right? If you were a capable swimmer, there was really no risk to yourself, you saw the child drowning, you had nothing else of moral significance that you had to give up, and then you just stood there and watched them drown, right? We might think you did something wrong by your inaction. That's precisely the kind of intuition Singer is hoping to, in some sense, place in you through this argument. That we look at charity, we look at giving to the needy, right, people who are in extreme poverty, as something supererogatory. It's really good to do. You're a great person if you do it, but you're not doing anything wrong if you don't, right? You don't have an obligation to do it. Singer is trying to argue precisely, just like the drowning child case, right? You in fact do something wrong if you don't give. Right? So this argument, right, if we accept the argument, Singer thinks this redraws this usual distinction between charity and duty, right? We don't violate our moral duty simply by not assisting, right? Whereas often it's seen instead that our moral duty really lies in, minimally at least, not making other people's situation worse, right? Not hurting them, not harming them. We're going to see Narveson really defend this view. But Singer thinks, right, we do something wrong just by not helping, if we can, without having to sacrifice something of moral significance. Okay, so two objections, right? And so I'll pause here for a second and just come back to this point. You know, who does this argument apply to, right? Well, anybody who could give resources. Well, let's just stick with money, right? Money is a nice stand-in for all sorts of resources. Anybody who can give their resources, can give money, without sacrificing something of moral significance, to help the distant needy has an obligation to do so, according to Singer's argument, and does something wrong merely by not doing it. So what does that mean? Well, look, if I spend $5 or $10 or whatever on new clothes, new car, right? Coffee, watching movies, there's a nice one, right? Video games, et cetera, right? Anything that I can or could and often do buy, instead of buying those things, I could instead give that money to the needy, right? I could help people in extreme poverty by giving them those resources rather than using them to, say, watch movies. Right? And here's a good question. And I'll just put this out here. I didn't actually go look this up, but I think this is an interesting point. How much money does the entertainment industry make in a year? And of course, we can think about, there's sort of the film industry, which seems very relevant to our course. We've been talking about Valiant Reality, and we have Ready Player One and everything, right? There's, of course, the gaming industry, which has become quite large, television industry, right? Music, and more, right? How much money do these industries make every year? What if, for a year, right, people in the first world said, you know what? Let's not have new content. We don't need any new movies in 2021. We don't need any new television shows in 2021. We don't need any new music in 2021. Let's take all the money we would have spent on films and TV and, right, music and video games and whatever. Not even necessarily give up the ones we already have, but charitably donate, right, the money that we would have spent on that new content to alleviating extreme poverty in the world, right? How much of a difference would that make? I don't have an easy answer for you here. In a little bit, I'm going to talk some about that book, A Life You Can Save, that Singer has, where he does give some stats about how far that money could go. So, do a quick internet search. How much money does the film industry make in a year? How much money does the video game industry make in a year? Interesting questions, right? To what extent does Singer's argument apply to you and me, right? This isn't just a question for the super billionaires. This isn't just for the super elite. This isn't just for the millionaires. This argument applies equally well to people like you and I, assuming that you have enough money that you could give at least some of it away to people who are suffering and in some cases dying due to a lack of resources, instead of spending that money on something that's not really morally significant, right? There's a question about what exactly counts as that. That's a good one. Come back to that a little bit with Narvis. Okay, now we're on to the 2 objections and the 3 practical points Singer makes. So the 2 objections. First objection, the proposal is just too drastic, right? It will actually lead to fewer people acting morally. Well, Singer responds to this one, right? To Singer, the argument seems sound, right? He doesn't see where the problem in the argument is. Now, of course, you might not like the conclusion, but that doesn't mean the conclusion isn't adequately supported by the premises. It also does not mean that the premises themselves are not acceptable, right, or likely to be true. If the conclusion of the argument is at odds with our usual moral code, Singer thinks, so much the worse for our usual moral code. It's up to someone to show how the argument is wrong and how our usual moral standards are right. Just because it doesn't make us feel good, just because it seems a little bit unusual or a bit drastic to us, doesn't mean it's incorrect. Now, some thinkers like Sidgwick and Urmson, a couple other moral philosophers that we don't need to get into, make the argument that if moral standards are set too high, people will lose all motivation to follow them. Singer thinks the following is likely true. We judge actions based on our moral standards. If we raise our moral standards, actions will raise in quality to be in rough accordance with our moral standards, although variations between people will still occur, right? Based on what we now take to be our moral standards. Some people are saints, some people are sinners, right? Some people are great, some people are terrible, some people overshoot the mark, some people undershoot it. But knowing roughly what most people expect of us, morally speaking, does influence our actions. So Singer thinks if we increase the moral bar, so to speak, right, the what we consider to be the minimum standards of morality, that will influence the way people act. Singer also thinks that it's unlikely that raising the moral bar for ending preventable suffering and death, right, making it obligatory rather than something supererogatory, he thinks that's unlikely to cause a general breakdown in the moral order. Even if others don't adopt the new moral standards and act accordingly, that doesn't change our duty to assist the distant needy. Second objection: the seeming absurdity of the conclusion that we ought morally to be working full-time to relieve great suffering of the sort that occurs as a result of famine and other disasters. Right? What's this? Well, with that conclusion, right, that we ought to, basically, if you can do something to help end extreme poverty, then you're morally obligated to do it. So, let's say I give $5 to relief organizations, right, to help people in extreme poverty. So I give $5. I didn't sacrifice anything of moral significance, right? I still have enough money for my food and shelter and medical care. So I gave $5. Okay, well, good for me. Now, of course, it's not the case that everybody else is giving their $5. So even though I gave $5, there are still people who are suffering and dying from lack of access to food, shelter, and medical care. Have I discharged my moral obligation? Have I lived up to my duty? No, right? Because there's still people suffering and dying, and I still have another $5, and another $5 after that, and another $5 after that. In fact, if I really wanted to, if I wanted to strip my life down to basically to the point, and this is where the objection comes in. It seems like that Singer's conclusion means that I have to give away my own resources, my own money, until I'm basically in the point that I'm in extreme poverty, or I'd just be switching places with somebody in it, right? To give them my last $5 and then put myself in extreme poverty. Well, now I'd just be switching positions. So it seems like that seems to be the consequence, or a way to sort of work around it rather than just sell off all my stuff and basically put myself in extreme poverty, assuming I can be more helpful over time by retaining at least some of my possessions, and then working full time to relieve great suffering. Right? Keep working in whatever capacity I do, and then basically giving all of my excess funds or resources to this kind of cause. That's really what the objection is, right? That we should be basically handing over the majority of all of our paychecks to ending extreme poverty. Singer agrees that few, if any, people are likely to actually do this, right? To hand over most of their money all the time. But he says that doesn't count as evidence that it's not the case that we ought to do it, right? An argument must be made to show why that conclusion would be wrong. Again, just because it seems unusual, just because it seems drastic, right, or absurd, Singer says that doesn't mean it's incorrect. That just means it's at odds with what we usually think, right? But until we've shown that what we usually think is correct, the mere fact that this is at odds with it doesn't mean that this is wrong. Again, if the argument in the first place is sound, it's up to somebody to show where it goes wrong, or why the conclusion that it supports ought not to be endorsed. All right, so those are the two objections. Now for the three practical points. First, government should play a role in aiding the impoverished, but we still have a duty to aid. So some people maintain that government should be responsible for aid instead of individuals. Singer sees this as an excuse to not do your moral duty. To not give now because you believe that it will entice governments to give more later is refusing to stop a presently occurring evil, as Singer says, without being able to point to any tangible beneficial consequence of their refusal. Now, people may contest that by not giving now, they're encouraging governments to step in, right? If we don't charitably give money, that's going to force government, the government of Canada or whatever, to step in and give more on our behalf, right? Singer thinks it likely that if people are not willing to assist the distant needy and militate for it, then governments are highly unlikely to do anything about the issue themselves, right? Us not doing what we should do morally is not going to sort of force or encourage the government that represents us to do anything about it. Right? Second, population growth should also be limited to prevent future suffering. Some argue that stopping famine now is just laying the groundwork for a larger famine later, once the needy have increased their population. However, the correct conclusion is not to let people starve and die now, but rather this again is Singer's words, that the best means for preventing future famine in the long run is population control. Right? So he is in favor of population control. Now we can sort of leave it outstanding, right? Is this going to be coerced? Is it voluntary? One point on this as well is that as something that's been discovered in recent decades, as standards of living go up, as sort of the mean resources of the community increase, the birth rate tends to decrease, right? So as a community gets wealthier, the population growth slows down, right? And in fact, I read a piece recently, I can't remember off the top of my head, I could probably find it and send you a link if somebody wants it, requests it, which was actually speculating, sort of looking at how the distribution of wealth is sort of being redistributed across the globe, looking at population rates, and that in fact, the overall population of Earth might start declining at some point. I think it was this century, or it might be next century, that we're actually going to hit a peak and then sort of come down, not like a stark drop necessarily, but that it was going to sort of even out and then actually start going down for a while. All right, third, how much we must give away, right? So this third practical point, how much do we have to give away? Well, it's going to be the potential end of consumer society as we know it. Right? So how much should we give? One answer is to the level of marginal utility, which Singer explains is the level at which, by giving more, I would cause as much suffering to myself or my dependents as I would relieve by my gift. Right? Like I said, if I'm down to my last $5, and if I give it to somebody in extreme poverty, then I wind up in extreme poverty. I wind up in their situation. I just switch. That's the point of marginal utility. Now, Singer doesn't endorse that position here. We don't have to sort of bring ourselves down to that point. On the moderate version of the second premise, Singer says, it should be clear that we would have to give away enough to ensure that the consumer society, dependent as it is on people spending on trivia, rather than giving to famine relief, would slow down and perhaps disappear entirely. Right? There's space to argue here on consequentialist grounds, right, on utilitarian grounds, that if we give away too much in the short term, well, we will end up giving away less in the long term. That is a serious argument to be posed, but it does not seem capable of justifying spending on trivia and luxury goods that is characteristic of the consumer society. So, oh, look at this. I forgot about this in my notes. So going back to what I was saying earlier, but go look up what the entertainment industry brings in. It's still worthwhile. My notes are a little dated on this. This is from 2017. I've got a piece here from Variety called Global Box Office Hits Record $38.6 billion in 2016. So the box office revenues were $38.6 billion. Stats Can, this is from 2015. The film, television, and video production industry reported $4.8 billion in total operating revenue in 2015. I believe that was in Canada. Right? So we're talking about billions of dollars here that we spend on film and television that we could be spending on getting people food, shelter, and medical care. What's more important, watching an entertaining movie or saving somebody's life by making sure they get the medication they need? In The Life You Can Save, that book by Singer from 2009, he tells us the following. This is on pages 6 to 9, so a couple different quotes here. The World Bank defines extreme poverty as not having enough income to meet the most basic human needs for adequate food, water, shelter, clothing, sanitation, healthcare, and education. In 2008, 1.4 billion people were living in extreme poverty, living on $1.25 a day or less. That amount is adjusted for regional pricing differences, so they're living on $1.25 a day or less, as if they were living in the United States of America. Life expectancy in rich nations averages 78 years. In the least developed nations, it is under 50 years. In rich countries, less than 1% of children die before the age of 5. In the poorest countries, it is 20%. 20% of children die before the age of 5. UNICEF estimates that approximately 10 million children die every year from avoidable poverty-related causes, along with another 8 million older children and adults. Not only in that book does Singer point out the impacts of extreme poverty and what it is, but he also points out some of our excesses, our by what are, I mean the affluent in the first world. It says, on average, Americans spend only 6% of their income on food. For pennies a day, we can have all the water we need from a tap, and we can make coffee and tea at home extremely cheap, yet we spend millions of dollars in buying bottled water. Apparently 31 billion liters were bottled in the US in 2006. And to-go beverages, right? 14% of household garbage is inedible food. He says on page 11 of that book, $100 billion of food is wasted in the United States every year. Question, how much does it cost to save a life? In that book, Singer estimates that the cost is somewhere between $200 and $2,000, depending on the location, issue that's threatening the life, etc. On the cheap end, roughly 3 million people die a year from diarrhea. Now, you may have just chuckled. If you did, ask yourself, are you a good person? Right? It might seem funny, but people actually die from this. Right? They could be saved with a little knowledge and a few cents worth of materials. Hundreds of thousands of children still die from measles and could be saved with a $1 dose vaccine. Millions of children die from malaria in Africa, and for about $10, they could be provided with netting to keep out mosquitoes, thus preventing malaria. So this is the argument Singer has for us, right? And assuming you have really any kind of disposable income at all that you can spend on trivia like movies, video games, going out to eat somewhere, right? Ordering in food, right? And you know, do I really need all those books on the shelf? Do I really need the painting in the background, right? Do I really need this shirt versus say an older one or you know, something like that? This is what Singer's talking about. This doesn't just apply to those rich people, right? Because we all have the moral duty based on the situation facing us. Even though fewer people now live in extreme poverty than did back when Singer wrote the article, and even when Singer wrote The Life You Can Save in 2009, there are still people living in extreme poverty who are suffering and dying due to preventable causes because they don't have enough resources. Much the same as in Elysium. There, the difference that we see is that the super elite have quite literally given up on Earth. They've moved to a different place, right? Much like the super elite now live in different places, right? There's probably not a billionaire living on my street, right? They're going to live in a different area where they've removed themselves from many of the impoverished, the needy, the suffering. Do we think now that that somehow changes their obligation? Does it change our obligation? Do the citizens of Elysium somehow change their own moral obligation to the needy people of Earth by moving up to the space station? Right? Presumably not. What does that mean for us? Well, that's something for you to think about. I'll be back next day looking at Jan Narvison's piece, where he's going to argue against Singer's conclusion by arguing that, in fact, morality really is based on self-interest, right? That it's our own selfishness that leads to a certain set of moral duties, as well as some duties of justice. We're going to see the distinction he draws. And ultimately, Narvison says, you don't do something wrong by not helping the needy. But boy, you sure would be nice if you did it. Until then, I hope you're well, and bye for now.